Welcome back everybody, and today we're going to be taking a look at creating landscape materials the easy way. This is a simplistic yet impactful approach at creating your first landscape material. This is also the same sort of process which I've used creating landscape materials on such shows as the Mandalorian series, Avatar: Last Airbender, and many more. How often when we're creating landscapes do we try to find resources, different videos, go onto the marketplace, and there's beautiful stuff on the marketplace and there's a lot of great content out there. However, oftentimes things may seem overcomplicated, especially if this is your first time jumping into Unreal Engine or you're still getting familiar with it. So this is my way to sort of showcase how to create something that is not only going to work, that is going to be simple to understand, but also something that you can actually use on productions. You don't need overcomplicated materials and assets, things of that sort, to create really high quality environments. Ultimately, what you need is really just a good combination of materials, lighting, and of course, different assets, references, things like that. So let's go ahead and jump right in. Here we are in Unreal Engine, and we just have a very simple light setup as well as a scale model. Having a scale model in your scene, first and foremost, becomes really important. Creating believable environments first starts with scale, as well as, of course, your references and everything, but you want to make sure that everything is going to be to scale. It's something that the brain unconsciously or sometimes consciously really picks up on and recognizes. And so having a scale model is very important. You can download these from the marketplace. You can Google search free, human scale OBJ, and use whatever sort of scale model that works for you. Sometimes people even just use cubes. But yeah, let's go ahead and talk about this material. I'm going to make a new material. I already have one for landscape in here, so I'm just going to call this landscapes. And I'm going to right click in here, and we're going to go to material. And we're going to name this MM for master material underscore landscape. And then let's go ahead and open this, and we see here, we have our material output node right here. And what we're going to do is we're actually going to go over here to this use material attributes, and we see it condenses it all into one little pin. The reason being is because what we're going to be plugging everything into is what's known as a landscape layer blend, and the output is only one pin. Now you can go in here, break material attribute, and plug it in like this. It would render the same sort of result, just like if you plug this all back into a make material attributes and did this sort of thing. So there's many ways to get to the same results. It's one of the reasons actually why it's one of the double-edged swords really of Unreal Engine, in that there's so many ways to do the same sort of thing, get the same sort of outcome, and it can be kind of confusing, especially when you're first getting into this stuff. What I will say is there's no real right or wrong way of doing it, as long as the outcome is the same. Ultimately, it just depends on what you're trying to achieve, the sort of functionality. So this material we're going to be making is going to be somewhat of more of a base sort of material. This is going to be the material that you're going to use as a sort of foundation for which you can build upon, and we'll add some sort of bonus stuff here towards the end of this video as well. So first and foremost, we're going to add some layers. The amount of layers, these layers are going to dictate the amount of layers you're going to be able to paint in your actual landscape. And so here we see they're all named layer none. One thing to remember is Unreal Engine, when you're using Unreal Engine, naming conventions are really important. Now, things don't have to be particularly spelled, a specific sort of way or whatever. However, if you're going to be linking things, you want to make sure that they have the same name. Also, just organizationally, you want to make sure they have the same name. So this one, we can name base. This one, let's go dirt. And this one, let's say moss. And the other things we see here, this blend type, there's weight blend, alpha blend, and height blend. The most common ones you're probably going to use is either weight blend or height blend. The difference being is weight blend more so takes in consideration the sort of weight of the brush, whereas the height blend will actually take into account the displacement map or whatever sort of mask you have that you're using for it, but actually take that into account to actually blend between the materials. So for this, we're actually going to use height blend, and we see now we have an extra pin for both. The reason being is the height is sort of calculated separately, that displacement blend is handled separately, and so we want to make sure that we are going to be plugging our displacement stuff into here and our actual, all of our materials into here. So first and foremost, what we're going to want to do is right click, and we're going to grab a texture sample. You can either do it this way, or if you've already downloaded materials from Megascans, then you can just grab the textures from Megascans and you can bring them in. All right, so I just went ahead and grab some textures from Megascans, from surfaces, just drag them, drop them in here. And the next thing we want to do is I'll hook these up first, and then we'll take a look at this one. So for your normal map, first and foremost, you want to convert this to a parameter. And we're going to name this base underscore normal. You can also just do base and then like space. You don't necessarily need to do the underscore. I grew up using the underscore, so for me it's like second nature. Convert to parameter, base, ARD. And we know this is ARD because that's actually the name of it. Well, it's ORD, occlusion, roughness, displacement. The A also occlusion, ambient occlusion. ARD or ORD, doesn't matter. Either one's perfectly fine. And then same here. So base, albedo. If you're wondering how do we know to name it base, I'm just naming it based off of whatever the layer name is. So whatever your layer name is, you want to make sure that your nodes are going to have the same sort of naming convention. So with this texture, for those of you that may or may not know, this is what's known as a channel pack texture. So if we go in here and swap through the different channels, red, ambient occlusion, green is roughness, B is the displacement. So ORD, RGB. And so let's go ahead and give this some parameters actually. So the ambient occlusion, to be perfectly honest, I don't really use the ambient occlusion that often, but the roughness, I'm going to actually plug this into a power node. You could also use a cheap contrast node. If we open the cheap contrast node, it's built differently, but it does essentially the same thing. Personally, for creating contrast in the roughness, I found that the power node seems to do a bit better with that. And I'm going to hold S on the keyboard and left click to create a scalar parameter. Scalar parameter is what you're going to use whenever you just need an arbitrary number value. So if you need to add, an intensity slider on something or a number value, and you want to be able to control it in your material instance, that's when we're going to be using the scalar parameter. And so this one, I'll name it base, rough, contrast, just give value 1. And I'm going to hold M as in multiply and left click to bring in the multiply node. The multiply node is probably the most common node you're going to use to combine different things. There's also like subtract, add, divide. We're not getting into those today, but things like the scalar and multiply are probably going to be the nodes you're going to be using the most throughout your sort of material development. And this one, hold S again, left click for another scalar, and we'll call this base, rough, int for intensity, give a default value of 1. Cool, so now that is set up, and we can even copy paste this, so Control C, Control V, plug that into the displacement so we can have a bit more control over that, and call this, just rename this base displacement contrast and base displacement intensity, and leave it all the same. The normal map, we're going to pull out here. We're going to use a flatten normal, and with this we actually have to reverse it, because what this node actually does is if I plug this in and we start cranking up the values or whatever, it's actually going to reduce the normal map intensity. And one thing you can technically do is you can give it negative numbers. However, we tend to want to stay, like, if we want to make something stronger, we want to give it positive values, and weaker or less intense, we want to give it those those lesser values. So to keep everything organized, we still want to use positive numbers. So we have to invert this. And the way we do that is with a node called a 1 minus node, like so. And then we could just rename this to normal int intensity. If you want to spell it all the way out, you can. And then for the albedo, one thing I actually like to do, and you can set this up manually as well, but one thing I like to do actually is, we have megascans. We all use megascans. It's very accessible to all of us who use Unreal Engine. And there's a lot of great stuff that they actually built into megascans. And so what I tend to do is I'll just grab the aspects of their material that work well within my own workflow, and I'll just adopt that into my material. So for instance, if we open up their Megascan master material and open up this, they have all these different controls. In my opinion, the control that sort of makes the most sense is the albedo controls. These are really great. And, like I said, we can make this, or we can just Control C, Control V. What I will say is when you are working in a production setting, oftentimes you are working in a way in which you need to provide quality, and you need to provide quality pretty quickly, especially if you're working in virtual production, where things are constantly changing. So, this, which again, you can build, might take you 30 seconds or takes you 2 seconds to just hit Control C, Control V. Personally, I like to just copy paste it and then just rename it. So base. Next thing we want to do is we want to grab everything, and in the group right here, we want to change this to group base, and same with these, change it to group base. So this way in the material instance, they're all together. And as far as tiling goes, there's a few ways you can tile things. The classic way is using a texture coordinate, plugging it into a multiply, giving it a scalar, naming it like base tiling, and you'd plug this into the UVs, like so. And the other way, the two other ways, is you can use a texture variation node, where you'd plug this into here, and this ARD, you basically just grab a texture sample. You can copy this one, paste it. You need to convert it to a texture object. And if you want to know how do I know that, is if you actually look at some of these functions that are sort of built into the engine, in parentheses, they kind of tell you what they want you to put in here. So height map T2D means texture 2D. This parentheses S is scalar. This is a vector 4. SB is static bool, so just to turn it off and on. But yeah, so that's how you kind of know what to put where. So for this one, you want to make sure that it's named the same as this as well. So we convert that to parameter, base, ARD, plug that in. And what this one is going to do, actually, here, let me showcase it like this real quick. Make material attributes. So we are going to plug this all into a make material attribute, so we can actually plug it into something. If you are going to be using the displacement feature in 5.3, then you would plug this into displacement, of course. Let me go ahead and do this. Okay. So right now, this material is using the classic base sort of tiling. And I'm just going to put this on a plane real quick to make it easy, like so. And if I go over to materials, landscapes, and if I put that on here, I'm going to tile that a few more times. Tile of 3. Okay. Let's do a tile of like 5. Okay. So if we put it on here, we see how we're getting this tiled pattern. And this texture variation node can be a really quick and easy way to create breakup and variation. Now you can sort of right click on these, promote these two parameters as well. But for right now, let's just plug this shifted UVs into here. Hit apply. And we see how that tiling is broken up now. And one thing that you will see, and it may or may not be super apparent, it's kind of apparent right here, but it'll create these sort of lines. What this is doing is it's using the sort of algorithm to just sort of break up and warp the actual placement of the material, which again can be effective if you want to break up your tiling. So if this is something you're struggling with, you know, you're seeing a lot of repeating patterns, instead of just using this, which again classically this is kind of, you know, like material 101, like your first tiled material, you do this. If you just plug it into a texture variation node and create a texture object, it's really that easy. I mean, of course, you can like right click on this, promote to parameter, you know, hover over it. The base is 3.24. Variation level for this one, right click on this. Yeah, so we can add these. So we can add these scalar parameters and have a bit more control over the variation breakup. So if we go back to our material, create material instance, if we put that material instance on here, then go to it, we see now there's this variation level, variation scale. So you can play around with it and see what it's like actually doing to the material if you'd like. So yeah, but again, like this is pretty easy to set up. You just need this and that. If you are using a channel pack texture, you want to make sure that this mask channel, this one actually, if you promote to parameter, it'll give you an error. So we need to actually, for this one, we need to actually type it in. So it needs to be a constant 4 vector is what it needs to be. And we know it needs that because V4, so it needs 4 vectors. And for this, because it's the displacement channel, we need to use the blue channel. You can either plug blue in here, or you can give the blue a value of 1 and plug this into there. Whichever one you want to utilize works. And we hit apply. Cool. And we see now how that's working. So with this, let's go ahead and move this over here. Grab that landscape layer blend again. 2, 3. Do base. Dirt. Or let's have the base. The base will be dirt. This one will be moss. And then this one will be a path. The path will be for a little extra demo thing at the end. So with this, we can plug this one into layer base, and the height, which by the way, I renamed these to blend. So base blend contrast, base blend intensity, because that's what it's actually doing. And it'd be a lot easier as we're going through the material instance to understand that. Cool, so we got that. And we can organize this all a little bit if you'd like. Go in here, and with this, we can just copy this, paste this, and from here you just do same sort of thing and kind of rename things. I'm not going to switch out the materials here. I'm going to end up switching them out in the material instance. But for this, just name this one moss, and I'm just going to copy and paste that. And that's really all we need to do as you sort of duplicate through here, is just change the names and the grouping of it. So change it all to moss. The variation scale, you can leave that in its own thing. It kind of knows where to go. This, change it all to moss. There. Okay. And again, these sort of materials, you can add any sort of functionality to these materials. You can, add slope angles, water lines, and splat maps, and you can really, go pretty wild with these materials and add any sort of functionality to it. These work as really great foundations, and to be honest, again, oftentimes this is really the extent you generally need to go with. As we go through here and we sort of add these things like so. I mean, there are cases, for example, on productions where, maybe you do need to add additional functionality and you need to create, more complicated materials, things like that. However, again, we tend to be working against the clock when we're working on, different shows and things like that. You might get handed, 47 sets in 8 months to do it, and which sounds like a decent amount of time. However, it quickly becomes the case that that's no time at all. So you need to work pretty quick usually. And so what I'm getting at is, if you don't need a particular sort of, function in your material, then there's not really a need to do it. Like, you don't need to overcomplicate your materials in order to make something that looks good. I feel like oftentimes we mistake complexity for good, when oftentimes it's really these like simplistic approaches that really just seem to work. It's just creating these simple materials, knowing which materials will go well together and why, which comes from looking at reference, by the way. And then, of course, just building something that's aesthetically pleasing, something that looks good, ultimately. So go ahead and finish this up. And then plug all of this in, like so. And later on, we'll go over a bonus tip on how to organize this, make this all look a little better. But for now, we'll just plug this in, and this will be our landscape material. So hit apply. Let's go ahead and get rid of that plane. Let's go ahead and bring in a landscape. Go ahead and put the material instance in here. And go ahead and hit create. And here it is over here. It is glowing, and that is because right here we don't have any landscape layer info. So when you're doing this, you need to make sure that you are creating your layer info. And so for this, we're going to use weight blended layer. I'm just going to save them here to make it quick. Weight blended layer, save, like so. Cool. So now I'm going to bring my scale model over here as well. And again, working with the scale model is great, because then you can kind of determine how big or small your texture should be. So for example, we're looking at this. Texture is really tiny right now. So we can go ahead and we can adjust that. And you see how everything is under, base, moss, path, and then there's the texture variation ones. The way to get these groups, that's what we are doing over here. So down here under material expression group, that's how the material instance sort of organizes things. So do keep that in mind. And with this, we're just going to go through and I'm just going to swap out some of the textures, some Megascan textures here, like so. And let's find some sort of moss. I don't want a gravelly moss. I might use the gravelly moss for the base. Yes, and so we see here, for example, actually, that right here under the base group, there's only base. So we can go back here and we see that, you know, as we're going through renaming things, we actually put that in the moss group and this in the moss group. So there we go, base. And so now that's fixed. There we go. Cool. So yeah, so let's actually use this ground. Might work a little better. And we will use another mossy ground. That one. Change these. Not that one. Okay, use this one, and here. And then path, I'm just gonna find, I believe I have a cobblestone. There we go. Cobblestone, normal, and the ORD. Perfect. And then from here, we're just gonna adjust the tiling real quick. Go down here. Base tiling. Tiling, set that to, let's say, 1. Looks a bit better. We can maybe make it even a little bigger. 0.5. Okay. Starting to look better. What I tend to do also is instead of going in and painting, because you see how it does that, it'll do this sort of, like it'll like calculate the component that we're painting on. What I tend to do first is I'll just go in here and just fill layer, just to almost like preload it onto the environment. So for here, I'll do the same. Set this tiling to 0.5, and then same with the cobblestone. Right click, fill layer, and set that to 0.5. Right, there we go. Awesome. So now that we got that going, you can go back in here, fill layer, and I'll paint in some of this moss. And actually, if I go in here and under blend and start changing some of these values for the blending, we'll actually start to get more sort of height blend, if you will. And so that's what the sort of contrast and the blend intensity were all about. And it would appear that for base, I put everything under the moss group. So let's go ahead and change that. And with this, again, we have the same controls that we did with Megascans for the albedo. So go in here, go into an unlit mode, for example, and we can change some of these values, increase the brightness maybe. So let's try to match this grass to this sort of grass a little bit. So we could do that, change the tint, give it a bit more like yellow. Like so. Bring down the saturation a little bit, and maybe reduce that contrast just a tad more. Okay, let's see. We could refine it a bit more, but ultimately that's how you would refine it, is going through albedo controls. Make sure you're in unlit mode. Maybe even add a bit more yellow. Okay. Okay, we'll leave it as is for now. Go in here, back to landscape, start painting this a little bit. And then same with the path, so we can start painting that path in, like so. Oops, I'm gonna get rid of that and turn that brush size down and increase that blend intensity and contrast as well. So now we do that. We got a bit more contrast in that blend. So you see this, for example, the rocks are sort of still kind of on top. If we like reduce this back to like 1 and 0, it's just a bit more like feathered on the edges. So we can like so. So this is really, for a landscape material, really all you generally need to do, to be honest. Again, you can make it as complicated as you want. You can add splat maps. You can, you know, do something in Gaia, export those masks and utilize those however you want. You can create auto sloping, which we can do here in a moment. You could do so many different things to this. But again, this is just a good sort of base to start with, and it's also, you know, a simple way to get into landscape materials. So go down here, exit out. So a little trick I wanted to show to you guys that, especially if you're new to Unreal Engine, probably don't really know about this, but if we can get rid of that real quick. Let's say we were making a path, so we're like doing this sort of thing, and we can go through and reduce the size of all of these. Side fall off 200 and 200. So as we're doing these spline paths, of course you can use geometry. By all means, use geometry for your paths. However, one thing that can happen is if you're using the landscape grass output, and so let's say we're populating grass on, you know, on this texture, but we don't want it on the path one, we can actually separate it with this path. So to demonstrate that just very quickly, if I were to go in here, add a landscape grass output and a landscape layer sample, and we'll sample base, plug it into here, grass, and just go ahead and make one of these real quick. Materials, landscapes. Go to foliage, landscape grass type, base, plug it in. And I'm just going to give it like one grass type just for the sake of this demonstration. Oops. Let's do like a thicker grass. There we go. Save. Okay. Apply. Okay, so now we have all this grass in the scene, and we can run into an issue where if we have an actual piece of geometry, I will just make one real quick. Modeling, rectangle, place it down. And just give it a little bit of geometry, just big transforms, cool. Okay. So if we are going to use that for a spline mesh, and so we select the segments, we add a spline mesh component. Paste. Okay. So now we have this mesh in here. And one of the problems is the grass is, you know, encompassing, you know, this sort of pathway, right? It's not respecting it. So the best way to get rid of this actually is within your segments. So you can select all your segments. you're going to type in layer. And under layer name, we can change it to that path layer. And we see how now that path is actually encompassing the segments here. So, I mean, we can even get rid of the mesh itself and just have that be the material, like so. And then to get rid of the grass, what we need to do is add another one, and we'll just leave that there, and we'll use a landscape layer sample, because of this one, path, and then we can actually subtract these two there, or sorry, rather into here, so we don't need that second one. We can redo that. Like so, and subtract it, hit apply. And so now the grass will spawn everywhere except for the path that you made, like this. And so again, all it is you're sampling that first layer and you're subtracting it from your path layer. And then in your landscape spline, your segments, it's under layer. You just type in layer, layer name, name it to path. And now you have this path that if we go in here and we start moving things around, we see how the grass is going to like procedurally conform around all of it, like so. Now, as a bonus tip, one way in which we can organize our landscape materials, and this is more often what I do with my landscape materials, or how I build my landscape materials, is go in here, right click, create a new folder, and we'll call this functions. And we'll go into material function, name this mf underscore base, copy paste that, rename it mf underscore moss, and then mf underscore path. And gonna go into our master material, and I'm just gonna open up all of our material functions here as well. And so all we need to do is take all of this right here and just copy it, paste it into base out right here, and this goes into the output results. And we can copy this, paste this, and name this one height. I usually increase the sort priority, otherwise the height will actually end up being on top as far as the sort of order. And we'll plug this blend into here. And if we want to use displacement, then we can plug this into, actually we can just plug this into displacement like so. Then hit apply. And it's going to be the same for the other ones as well. So we will grab moss right here, like so, and do this again. So the reason for doing this is really for the sake of organization. And especially if you are working on teams, you want your, whatever you're creating, you want it to, no matter how simple or complex it is, you want it to be easy to read, easy to understand, so that if someone had to go in and adjust something, that it's, you know, it'd be a lot easier for them to navigate and understand exactly what they're looking For those of you who are unfamiliar with material functions, I remember for me, took me a bit to like understand like what's the use case of a material function, when do I use it, why do I use it, how do I use it. The best way to sort of reconcile that is to really think of material functions kind of like as containers. So really, like if you just want to, at least initially, because you can do a lot of intricate things with functions, but initially just think of them as containers, like ways to organize whatever it is you're creating. And so in this case, for example, instead of having this big material branching tree that, even though it's quote unquote like more simplistic, there's still a bunch of nodes just here. And if someone were to open this, I mean, they'd probably be able to navigate it and change things, but also it just doesn't look that great to stare at. So instead, we just grab our material functions, and we need to plug in or hit apply for the path one, like so. And I need to increase the sorting priority. There we go. Cool. And then with this, we just plug it in like this, like this, like this, like this, like this, and that. And so ultimately, when you open up your landscape material with the functions, it would end up looking like this, which just looks a lot more clean. It's a lot easier to look at, a lot easier to manage. Again, if you're working on a team and someone opens this, it's not going to be like overburdening. When we see like a bunch of spaghetti, pretty much is what I like to call this. When we see a bunch of spaghetti like this, we tend to just like not want to look at it because it can look chaotic and like clutter. But yeah, the functions, they just act as a container. And so we still have the same exact material, except now it looks a lot cleaner. And it's going to do, the same stuff. And then we can, 5.3, we can turn on the nanite. Another little tip, if you are doing landscape or nanite landscape and you get this, currently as it stands, so maybe in a later update this will be fixed, but the displacement is actually adjusted here. So you can decrease that magnitude. So, and maybe even a little bit more, 0.25, maybe 0.5. Cool, so that's it for today's video. I hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial. I'm going to be making more tutorials like this moving in the future. More videos to sort of break down the complexities of Unreal Engine and make things hopefully easier for everyone to move forward in developing your own art pieces. Yeah, see you guys in the next one.